Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Tesol Kuwait podcast. Today I'm honored to be having Ms. Hawra Khalfan as our guest. Ms. Hawra is a second language English teacher at Payet in Kuwait. She has a lot of experience teaching English as a second language and is also a second language researcher. Today she's going to be joining us to discuss the impact of motivation in the classroom on behalf of students and teachers, and what role that plays in how the second language is acquired and how the classroom operates. So without further ado, I really hope that you enjoyed this podcast episode. So Hawra, you are our guest of honor today. So can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself? Like, what do you do and what are some of your interests? Also, if you have any research interests within the field of Tesol or linguistics.
Hi, I'm Hawra. I am a lecturer at Pate in the College of Health Sciences. I mainly teach beginner English classes. We're starting with more advanced classes this semester. By we, I mean me and my motivation are starting. My general area of interest when it comes to research is motivation. I'm very, very interested in psycholinguistics.
Okay.
And just like you, I also have a master's in TESOL.
Okay, that's so interesting. So I feel like our discussion today is a bit out of the norm, because when I said we're going to do motivation, everyone was like, okay, how to motivate students, right? And then it's like, no, us too.
Yeah.
We need the motivation as well. So I feel like the discussion that we're going to have about this is going to be interesting.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so our topic today is about teacher motivation. So first, I kind of wanted to ask, because I feel like this is something that a lot of teachers deal with, but it's not really discussed. Because everyone is like, oh, like, how can we motivate students more? What are some of the things that we can do to make them more interested in things? But then teacher burnout is a really real thing, and it's something that so many people struggle with. So I wanted to ask you, have you ever personally struggled with motivation as a teacher? And if so, are there specific things that you've struggled with?
Yeah, I have. Of course, I have. I've struggled with motivation as a teacher. I'm actually in the phase of trying to pull myself out of it. What are the things that cause it? Was that your question? I feel that in my specific context, تطبيقي students are very anxious students. And I'm really, really interested in the relationship between the effect of students' willingness to communicate or lack thereof on teacher motivation. Yeah. Because I found that when I began my job at Pate, I was very heavily motivated. I always had this very save the world mentality when it came to my teaching, because I knew that English was a global language and this could genuinely change my kids' I call them kids, but they're college students. It could change their life, but then I found a very slow decline in my own motivation. I went from very ideal self motivation. If we're talking about motivation, we can talk about Dornier's possible selves theory of motivation, and Dornier talks about your ideal self and your ought to self. And when I think about myself in that same lens, my ideal teacher self was who I began as, and I ended up more teaching to teach because it's my job. And I feel that personally a huge part of it was the students, because I tried every method that I could think of in terms of motivating students, but I noticed that my students come from the context of a heavy foreign language anxiety setting based on their prior educational, their history. And dealing with students from that context and being heavily motivated the students kind of just kept pulling at my motivation. And I got to a point where it felt like there was no point.
Yeah. No, that definitely makes sense. Do you feel like it's just a foreign language anxiety, or do you think that it's anxiety about being in an educational context in general? Because I feel like in Kuwait specifically, like the students are coming from very different educational backgrounds. Maybe they don't feel comfortable in the class. For a lot of students, it's the first time being in a class with females and males together. And I don't know if tatbiqi is like that, but I know that in Kuwait University, that is like one of the sources of anxiety. So do you feel like there is a way to like mitigate the anxiety if you use Arabic in the classroom, or do you feel like it doesn't make a difference?
It doesn't make a difference, genuinely. And especially since so in my master's, the thesis that I wrote had a lot to do with the impact of segregation on motivation, because I thought it was very interesting to study the difference between motivation in students who are in a mixed classroom and versus others who are in a segregated classrooms. And knowing that and still teaching segregated classrooms in Tatbiqi, we actually have segregated buildings even. I don't find the difference exists. And the only, wild card that exists here would be, could I be negatively influencing my male students' learning because I am female and they're not used to that? But I see the same patterns existing in my female classrooms as well, and they're used to being taught by females. So that leads me to believe that it's not the direct context of the classroom, but something deeper.
Yeah. Do you think that it's an attitude towards education in general or just towards learning English?
Honestly, I don't think it's an attitude towards education in general, because when I do discuss the issues that I face as an English teacher with my colleague who teaches physics, for example, or environmental science or whatever, they're shocked that I'm sometimes in a classroom where I'm talking and asking a very specific question, and the student that I'm asking, or even if it's like the general environment that I'm asking, like all the students, they just look at me. And I'm like, and they're like, it just gets like that, especially in the beginning of the semester before I get to gain their trust.
Yeah, there's always like those awkward few days, and then you have to hold yourself back because it is like it can bother you because you're like, okay, like I want to talk to you, I want to address you, but like everyone's just looking at you blankly. So then what are you supposed to do with that? And then it's hard to take that somewhere. So I feel like that, yeah, and I feel like that does not, I do agree with you. I feel like maybe there is like some discussion that could happen about how English is perceived in Kuwait, because I feel like there's two kind of perceptions. One is that maybe English is not seen as serious of a subject, so they don't really feel like they want to try that hard. And the second thing is that speaking English in general can have like that stigma attached to it. That especially I feel like with male students maybe is stronger. So that is like something that's really interesting.
I believe one of my colleagues in the language center did her PhD on English with male Bedouin students. So tribal, like male students who are raised in a very, very tribal way, and their perspective on English and why they're very hesitant. So yeah, I do think that there's a lot at play here.
So going off of that, do you think that a more motivated class impacts your performance as a teacher? And if so, how?
Yes, it does impact my performance, because when I feel that my students are here trying to learn, it feels very different to when my students are here because they have to, because they don't want to get an FA. And you can feel it, like you just the way that they're looking at you when you're explaining and when you're asking questions, or when you're trying to make sure that they're at a point where they're actively listening to you or taking in the information. And yes, it does affect me in that it makes me question, why am I even here? like if the people that I'm attempting to teach, and attempting is a very strong word here, if I'm attempting to teach adults, especially in the context of higher education, like I'm attempting to teach adults, but those adults don't want to be here and don't want to be learning. So what am I doing?
Yeah. It can feel really defeating.
Yeah.
But I feel like there is this attitude where it's like, oh, but it's the teacher's fault. Like if your students are motivated, it's because of you, because you're not doing enough. And do you agree with that attitude? Like, do you feel like that is always true? Is it sometimes true? What do you think about that?
I find that there is a level of enough that is very personal between the student and their context and the teacher. So, for example, something that I do to motivate my students, especially the 99 students who haven't taken an English class in any higher educational studies before, I do a Badliya party. It is just something I just created.
I wanted to actually ask you about that after I saw
Yeah,
that.
I just, because I noticed that every time I had conversations with my students and I attempted to understand why they are not responsive or why they're not showing up to class, or when they show up to class, what makes them pick up their phone, it was always about, I'm afraid to say something wrong and someone laughs at me because we have Bidliya culture here. And then it was always about, I don't want to be picked on and I don't know the answer and I feel stupid. I don't know how to pronounce the words and I always make mistakes. It's very, 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 very like circular. These answers are very, like almost always the answers I get. And I realized that the way I deal with it is open conversations and open communication with the students, but also giving them a chance that is not in a classroom setting, not in a traditional classroom setting where I'm giving a lecture and they're taking in everything that I'm saying, where I allow them to practice English. And so I tell them that we're going to do Badliya parties. And I have noticed a huge change in my students when it comes to Badliya parties. The same students who I'll ask a question and they'll say nothing, zero, like the entire, it's like echoes, just me, crickets in the background, you know? And then those same students, give them 2 weeks after the Badliya party, when they've created a community, when they've created trust between themselves, when they've noticed that I'm still trying, I haven't given up on them. Today, for example, my same students who refused to answer anything were arguing with each other over who gets to answer, and they were raising their hands. And I was like, ladies, a moment of love to all of you, because wow, I'm so pleasantly surprised that we got you here, you know? And they all giggled. They were all laughing because they were like, oh, yeah. They didn't even notice they were doing it. They got to a comfortable state.
That's great. Can you explain, just for context, first, what is a badliya? And then what is a badliya party?
So in the context of Kuwait, a badliya is a word that you would mispronounce, and whether it's in English or Arabic, it doesn't matter. And in Kuwait, this is a very common joke that is thrown around. Everyone is always listening for badliyat. And everyone is always listening for words that you mispronounce so you could be the butt of the joke. And so I thought that taking the concept of a badliya and owning it and asking students to bring their badliyat and a dish if they wanted to for the party made them more willing to communicate. It really like heightened their willingness to communicate in the classroom.
That's great. Can you give some examples of badliyat that they brought to class?
So they would bring, I have a student who brings, she always messes up her no with node. So she would go like, I knowed that. And it always makes me smile when I hear her, because my daughter makes the same mistake. So she also has that ed for irregular verbs. And so I didn't address it during the party, and that's one of the rules. So we made community rules for the parties where I'm not allowed to correct their English. I only speak to them in Arabic because my bedliyat in Arabic. So I wanted to kind of meet them. And as a Kuwaiti, my bedliyat in Arabic are very high. Like there are so many words I mispronounce. But when I'm teaching, and if I ever rely on Arabic for my teaching, I always tell my students, oh, I'm always a Badliya queen and it's okay. And I try to own it. But when I pushed them to own it, it was a very different experience. So yeah, during the Badliya party, they would bring their Badliyat and they would bring food and they would talk to each other and I would find them giggling to each other about Badliyat. Oh, miss, I said this and I meant this yeah.
I feel like that's a great way to also get them comfortable, like what you were talking about in the beginning with anxiety. And I feel like just them not being afraid to mess up in front of each other is like, that's such a big part of it.
Yes, and not just mess up in front of each other. There's also this other thing where if they mess up in front of teachers will always call them out and repeat their mistake and use them as an example.
They're used to.
Yes, and they're always expecting me to do that. And when they feel that they get to a point of trust with me where they know that I'm not using their mistakes against them and I won't highlight their mistakes, but later on when I'm explaining that lesson, I will reference the mistake, but not as attached to that specific student.
Not directly. That's a good way to do it. Yeah. I feel like also being vulnerable, like admitting that you also don't know everything, because I feel like that also gives them anxiety. Like, I feel like we have an upper hand because we're able to speak to them in Arabic. And I feel like that makes a huge difference. But my Kuwaiti is like really bad. So even when I'm speaking to them in Kuwaiti, I'm like, I'm going to make mistakes. I want you to correct me. Like if I'm saying a word wrong in Kuwaiti, just raise your hand and say that's not right. Or tell me later, like, oh, you said this wrong. Because I feel like we're all here to learn. Like there's no like shyness that you should have when it comes to not knowing a language, especially a language you're not familiar with. So I feel like that is, what you're doing is amazing.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think when it comes to a language that you're not familiar with, but you are expected to be familiar with, because they have been in English classrooms since childhood. And I think there's some form of shame involved. And that's why I always assume every English student I have, every student in my English class does have foreign language anxiety. I always assume it. And when I assume it, it motivates me to be a better student, and it motivates them to be better students as well.
Yeah. Do you feel like the institution that you're a part of should be playing a role in this, or do you feel like it's not really their job? Because when it comes to like placing blame with motivation, it's like, like the students either need to try more or the teacher needs to try more to engage the students. But do you feel like there needs to kind of be an academic cultural change that's maybe even bigger than us or bigger than just our subject?
So I don't feel that the institution can be to blame, because we are pushed to create committees for curriculum development. We are pushed to do professional development workshops for our departments. We are told that research will get us promotions, and we are always supported with research financially and otherwise. So I can't, with rational mind, blame the institution itself. But what I can do is highlight a problem to the institution and see what gets resolved. And that's why I'm really interested in doing my PhD on language anxiety and teacher motivation and their connected nature in Tatbiq.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Do you feel like it's different? I don't know how much you know about like the different institutions in Kuwait, but do you feel like there is a difference?
In what way?
Like, do you feel like certain students are more motivated in other colleges? less motivated in different colleges, maybe varying by major. Do you feel like there is a difference? I don't know if...
So for us, I've taught in 2 colleges now, technology and health sciences, where I currently am. And I haven't experienced much of a difference. But what I haven't done is teach bachelor students at health sciences yet. And if I do get to a point where I teach them, I keep hearing from my colleagues that they are so motivated. It's like having A students in a class full of A students when it comes to bachelor students. And so I don't know. I don't know. But I have taught in the Ministry of Education high school. I have taught in a private school, bilingual school. And I do see that there's a huge difference in motivation, but it's very hard for me to compare the motivation of the context of a public high school to a private high school here.
Yeah. I feel like that would be very different.
Yeah.
I have experience before KU teaching in 2 different private universities. And I don't think there is a difference in motivation. I feel like that's the same. What I would say is different is a difference in anxiety levels. And I feel like in private universities, there is a big like university culture. And a lot of students get to know one another through different things. And you'll come into a class and find that everyone already knows each other. Everyone's comfortable speaking in front of each other. Everyone's comfortable working with whoever you assign them with. Whereas I feel like with a bigger college, bigger institution, bigger university, I do feel like that lack of familiarity, like what we were talking about before, that can contribute to anxiety.
Yeah, potentially. I would not be surprised, to be honest, which is really interesting because I graduated from GUST. And in GUST, I remember taking English 101, which is like the basic English class for any bachelor. And yeah, there was a lot that our teachers could do. And I was surrounded by students who had graduated from government high schools, public high schools, and they were working just as hard as I was.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe harder even, because they didn't have the basic structure of English, and they got it done just fine. So it is very interesting to understand how the context of where they've applied matters, because in private institutions, English matters because they are taught every class in English. But here, the only classes that they need English for are English.
Yeah. So do you feel like that's also because they are used to being taught by Arabic speakers? Do you feel like, I don't know if, like, we obviously don't have that much experience with this, but from the people I know who are teaching students so the teacher's L1 is not Arabic, it's English or something else. They even have a harder time communicating and motivating students. So do you feel like that also plays a role in it? Do you feel like we do have a benefit because we are able to kind of find that common ground with them?
Yes, for sure. I can't imagine someone who can't speak Arabic teaching my students. But at the same time, I wonder how much more my students would be pushed to learn if their teacher didn't rely on Arabic. I'm just wondering, if I pretended not to speak Arabic to a class from the beginning of a semester and only explain things in English, would those students' English skills, because it's very heavily dependent on they have to pass, would they grow faster than, I mean, I don't know, but it's
Would you be willing to try that one semester and see how
I
it
would.
goes?
Anything for research. Everything is research.
Want to too. But then I feel like a lot of students can't communicate at all in English. So then it's like, how am I going to communicate with you if we can't speak to each other? So I feel like that's also a problem, because I feel like those students might become even more withdrawn. They'll just be like, okay, I'm just not going to talk. I'm just not going to, I might even fail. Like, I don't even care. Like, I'll just I can't, like, I'm not going to be able to.
Yeah, they'll probably say something, tell themselves something like, I'll fail and then I'll take it with someone who can speak Arabic.
Probably. Do you feel like that we as teachers, like, how can we foster motivation within ourselves? So even like regardless of the performance of the class and their levels of motivation, what can we do to motivate ourselves?
So I can only talk about my own practices and how I motivate myself. I motivate myself by always pushing myself to learn about teaching practices and trying new things. Because I noticed that at my lowest teaching motivation, I was a copy paste human being, you know? I was like, I've taught this class before. I don't really need to engage more with the content. It's easy. Like all I really changed was my summative tests, and everything else didn't really need changing. And so yes, I think that's something that is very useful. I've also been reminding myself that what makes a good teacher is a good human being. And reminding myself of that because I have a very high sense of justice when it comes to like who I pass and who I don't. And if I feel a student is attempting to use wasla or, you know, like attempt to use connections between us to get a grade, then like it always infuriates me. It always annoys me. And yeah, reminding myself that students are just human allows me to give them a lot more space to come late, miss classes, do things like that. Because as much as I want to, you know, be a traffic control officer and be like, 10 minutes late, if I focus on those things and those things are affecting my relationship with the students, then I'm not really doing a good job. And so I've told myself that for nothing against teachers who apply these rules. These rules exist for a reason. But for my teaching strategies and for my personality, I find that giving my students more freedom when it comes to coming in late or you know, if they miss an assignment, they're allowed missing one, and they're allowed to, these kinds of things have motivated me more because they take a lot less energy from me on things that don't really matter as much as the content and making sure that they understand the ideas. And it has become a lot more sustainable for students, maintaining students' lack of anxiety in my classroom.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because I feel like that's kind of like a conflicting ideology within teaching. It's like, do you need to focus on the rules or do you just want to focus on the content and then maybe feel like everything else is not really your responsibility? And I feel like it's interesting, like your perspective on it, because I feel like this is something that so many teachers have different perspectives about.
Yeah, I feel that there's a lot that teachers get pulled into that is administrative. And I don't connect with the administrative, because if we're jumping back into possible selves and ideal self and ought to self, my ideal teaching self is someone who teaches in a way that I'm like giving my heart to my students, not teaching in a way where I have to finish this content. And so I have to make them understand the, I don't know, past progressive. And so I'm just continuously repeating it and regurgitating the same information and just expecting them. Because if that was my goal, then yeah, traffic officer might be useful. But for me, I want to know them as humans, and I want them to understand that their relationship with English is not black or white. It can be middle ground where you're still learning.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take. And I feel like that's so valuable for them too. Because I also feel like, you know, like the public, especially system in Kuwait is so rigid. And it's like, oh, you need to get this grade so that you can like go to ilmi or adabi and like all these different things. And it's like, no, like it's about the process, even if you make mistakes. So that's a really valuable like perspective that you have about that. So you said that you were trying some new tactics every time you're engaging with the content. So have you had anything specifically that you mentioned the Bedliat party, but is there anything else you feel has been a valuable tool, like with teaching ESL?
Yes. There's one class that it's English 101. English 101 is given to all students in all the language, like it's under the language center, but it's given to all students in the same way for all colleges. And this semester, I told myself that instead of teaching them in the traditional way, and giving them the grammar that they need, subject verb agreement, and I don't know what, and modules and all this stuff, instead of teaching it that way, what I want to try to do is to meet those same objectives, but through a skill-based approach. And so from the beginning of the semester, I asked each of them where they feel that they could grow the most in their English class and what skill they really, really want to focus on. And I got them to brainstorm their perfect self-image at the end of the semester, where just through imaginative practice, through the you who walks out of this class, who is the you who walks out, and what did she look like, and what did she gain, or what did he gain, and if you walk out with this skill, what would it be that what would it be, and how would you use this skill in your life? And so I had them choose one skill, and they all get the same content, but what they give me for assessment is going to be based on that skill. So the speaking students would give me a presentation on that same content. The listening students would, and so I just divided it in that way. And I've noticed a huge change in their attitudes. I can't for sure say that this is going to be better in terms of understanding the content and stuff like that. It could just be the same, but the thing that grew more is their own personalities in their English class. I don't know. But I'm very interested to compare my students from last semester who took English 101, and which I taught in the traditional way, and then this semester, and see from quiz 1 to their last quiz, or from their midterm grades and final grades, and juxtapose it and see how their growth changed.
That's honestly a really amazing thing to try. I kind of want to try that too now, because I feel like they all have their own specific reasons for being in the class. Okay, they have to take the class, but they all struggle with different things. And I feel like when you try like a one size fits all approach, it's not going to work, or it does work, but then yeah, you see that they're not as motivated. And what I like that you're like talking about is like, mashallah, you're an amazing writer, and this is like a creative passion that you have, so you're kind of bringing that passion into the class by asking them to do some kind of like reflective work. So I feel like that's another like good tip for motivating teachers. Like, do you think that that's valuable, trying to kind of connect your own passion, even if it's kind of not related?
I do. I do, because whenever I think about my writer self and the kind of creative processes and the ways that I divide my projects and things like that, if I apply that same journey of growth to my students, then I can relate a lot more to them as students. Because sure, I do have English skills enough to teach them, but I don't necessarily have those same skills in that same way as a novelist. And I'm constantly, constantly, like always learning more. And it allows me to be more human and put myself like on their level.
Yeah, that's a really amazing way to think about it. So now what I wanted to do was engage you in some like rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So I'm gonna try to get to as many and like try to see if we can do it in like under 2 minutes. But I just want you to answer this with like the first thing that kind of comes to mind.
Okay.
And if you feel like you want to take a bit more time to think about the answer, you can. But I kind of want to just get like your immediate response.
Okay.
So What is the number one activity that you like to use in class?
Puzzles.
Puzzles. That's really interesting.
Just get them to find a solution.
Okay, that's really cool. What do you think is the hardest skill to teach?
Speaking.
Speaking. Do you feel like there is a least motivating day of the week for students and teachers?
Thursday.
Thursday. What about the most motivating day?
Tuesday or Monday.
Which is the more motivating semester, fall or spring?
Fall.
Definitely. What do you think is the best way to de-stress after a stressful day of classes?
Read.
And then what's one tip, if you have to give only one, for teachers who are dealing with burnout? What would you suggest?
Put yourself in your students' shoes. It's the only way to do it, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like when you see, like what you were saying, like see them as human, you know, like they make mistakes. Maybe they are not motivated. Maybe they're struggling with their own things. Like so many times they'll say like, oh, I have like my own things that I'm going through. Like they also have their own classes that are different than your class. So I feel like that mindfulness, like we have to apply it to ourselves and to them. Like we need to be aware of when we're experiencing burnout, and then we should also try and recognize it in them. Maybe they're going through a tough time or they're struggling with the material. Some students require more attention than others.
Yes, I when dealing with the mid-semester slump, I normally will have this Uno card in my head, you know, the draw four. I just throw it out in my, again, this is all in my head, but I always remind myself when I walk into a class, even if we have a test that day, if I look at the students and I'm like, okay, no, draw four, I need to draw from them. I can't be giving them right now. And I just sit on my desk and I can't sit behind my desk. I sit on my desk and I'm like, what's going on, guys? And I just try to get as much from them and take it in, because that's when they really just need to be heard. And this gets them so much more motivated for the end of the semester and their final exams.
That's amazing. I want to try that now as well.
Try it, yeah.
We need to like kind of connect to them more.
Exactly. And I'm always trying to find ways to connect to them.
Yeah.
Always. I always try to, and I think also being a parent helps with that, because whenever I want to teach a skill to my babies, I have to be at their level. And so I can't teach a skill to my students if I'm not at their level. I have to understand them first.
Honestly, that's true. Like that's connecting back to seeing them as human. Like at the end of the day, when they approach you, it's like they're your child, like not me, for me, maybe not my child, but like your younger sibling. Like I see my brothers and like so many of the boys who come in, like tell me that they need extra help with something. Like so many, like, you know, you just try to, like you said, being a teacher is about being human too. So like you need to have that human aspect in order to help them.
Yeah.
So that's something that I feel like if any teacher is kind of struggling with motivating themselves, then maybe getting back to like the root of it.
Yeah, sometimes institutions make it so hard for teachers to feel human. And it's not necessarily any institution. It's just the concept of having to make sure the objectives are met by the end of the semester or the end of the school year. It's how is a teacher going to maintain the humanity of each student and listen to each student if they have a classroom full of, I don't know, 50, 60 students who, you know, like it's just at the end of the day, you're like, this doesn't make sense.
This is a problem. This is a problem now with like so many colleges in Kuwait. I feel like you can't have a class that is meant to be skills-based and is meant to give feedback to every student. It's not a lecture at the end of the day. You're working with them. You're looking at what they're doing. Like you're going to each desk trying to see if they're doing it correctly. And then when you have a class of 60 students, it gets impossible.
Yeah. It really does.
It's just like something, that's why I was kind of asking, like, who do you think like is playing a role in kind of either creating or like depleting motivation? So I feel like it is something that we can all reflect on, like what are our individual roles as teachers, as the institution, as a student?
Yeah, definitely. And a huge part of it comes from the history, even because when we're dealing with adults who are walking into our classrooms at university or at college, they already came with their own bags of trauma and bad experiences. And for me to get to a point where I can try to alleviate some of that pressure that they're feeling, it's the end of the semester.
Yeah.
But I also have to make sure that they know all this grammar and they can do all this writing. And I have to check multiple drafts of their writing, and and it just doesn't make sense. At some point, it stops making sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Do you have anything you want to add? Any final thoughts about this?
No, not at all. I feel that we need to remind teachers that they have a role in their own motivation, and that they're allowed to not be their best selves some days, as long as they're meeting that best self on others. And yeah, I think that's the main thing that I want to end on.
That's a great way to end, and that's a great message to kind of give any teacher who might be struggling right now, especially during Ramadan, because I feel like a lot of us are struggling, but it's important to remember that at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy that you agreed to be a guest on the podcast, and it was amazing to talk to you and learn more about this topic from you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Samira. I appreciate you, and I appreciate Tesol Kuwait for what they're doing, because I feel that the platform is allowing a lot of educators who are struggling to teach English a means to feel heard and seen. So thank you guys for doing what you're doing as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.